I made this Godzilla vs. Kong animation on my own in 5 days. So I started off by making a concept for the animation in Microsoft Paint. I wanted natural terrain with cliffs and mountains in the background and a river running through. And then I wanted the big monkey boy jumping from cliff to cliff. I forgot to mention, up until later in the planning process, it was just meant to be Kong in the animation. So the idea was for Kong to jump from cliff to cliff, and I made a quick animation that's sort of roughly what I wanted it to look like, and this is what it turned out like.
I'm over here stroking my dick. I got lotion on my dick right now. I'm just stroking my shit. I'm horny as fuck, man. I'm a freak, man. Like, for real.
Yeah, not the best. I didn't put too much time into it, but if my janky animation wasn't bad enough, the hair was not working. He just ended up looking like a pubescent Bigfoot after getting his hair blow-dried. So I ended up going back to the drawing board and searching for a new Donkey Kong model, and I found this perfect one that looked movie quality. The rig on it was very intricate, and I could pose him exactly the way that I wanted to. And as you can see, the quality is bumped up a notch. But the fur on this model was beautiful. It looked movie quality. It looked incredibly realistic, and the texturing was perfect. Absolutely amazing. So now that I had my model of Donkey Kong, I needed to animate him. And after maybe an hour of trying to get the movement to look right, I ended up with this. And I have to say, it looks a lot better than the original crappy version that I had before. He actually has some weight to him, and the movements make sense. And it doesn't look as goofy. Now, the next part was getting the hair to look realistic, because even though the hair itself looked amazing, it didn't move with Kong. It was just static. So I had to do a hair simulation, and that ended up looking like this. Took a little tweaking to get it right, but I think it turned out okay. Although there is an error in the final version, the hair goes into the model, so he's actually bald for like half a second on his back. Everybody makes mistakes. But the next challenge I ran into is after I animated him sort of like jumping and reaching out, I didn't actually know what he was reaching out for at this point, so I decided to brainstorm. So I thought, I've got the perfect idea. Why not add Godzilla in there? I mean, they have movies together, they have since like the 50s. Godzilla is big, I can definitely find a model of him. Why not just throw him in there? So I thought, you know what? Another big monster wouldn't hurt. So I planned everything out, where Godzilla was going to be in the scene. I found a 3D model online for him, and then I got straight to animating. But after I animated him to look like he does in the movies, I realized even in the movies, he looks a little too mobile and a little bit too zesty and too animated. And I much prefer the way that Shin Godzilla looks in that movie because he's a little bit more menacing and a little bit more static, which I do like about it. But I ran into a big problem, which was all the models that I found for Godzilla were very smooth. Even when I added some bump to the texture, it was just too smooth. So I effortlessly sculpted Godzilla to have more scales and to make him look more armored and a little bit more detailed. I subdivided him as much as I could without my PC exploding. And here is the final product. Not bad, right? I mean, it looks passable. It looks like Godzilla. It's not exactly like the design in the Hollywood movies. I added my own little twist on it. And the animation was way less animated. It was way less zesty, and I like the way it turned out. The next part I was simultaneously really excited to work on, but also dreading, and that was the environment. I knew that I couldn't have a high detail environment and Kong and Godzilla and Kong's hair simulation all in the same scene, because otherwise my PC would just straight up. So I made the environment separately. I got some 3D scans of some real cliffs and a real desert and used that for the ground. But I ran into the same issue as I did with Godzilla, which was that it was too smooth. So how can I make this ground a little bit more detailed? Well, you just add rocks. And then you add more rocks. And since the rocks are different colors and they're very low poly, it just looks high detailed, and you can add thousands of them. And this 3D scan of the ground had a perfect dip for a riverbed, so I thought, that's perfect, I'm gonna add some water in, and I animated it to move along like a river. I added some foam on top, and some movement and waves, which you can't even see in the final thing, but I think subconsciously, it just kind of looks right if you add those details. And I also put some rocks in the background just to add a little extra to the scene, just to make it feel a little bit more believable. So you might be wondering, Xavier, what's that floating cube on the right side of the screen? Well, that's where the other cliff would be, but I realized if I add in another cliff, the scene's just gonna crash. So I thought I'm gonna render that out separately, and for now, just put a cube there. But this cube allows light to bounce off of it to make it look like there's a cliff next to Kong, and it also blocks the shadow from the sky to give it a little bit more depth. Without that cube there, and then just adding another cliff in afterwards, Kong would just be lit to fuck from the sky. So I added that to give it more realistic lighting. And I don't know why, but whoever made this model, they made him incredibly cheeked up. Incredibly. And then another touch that I added that was kind of smart was to add these black planes that block the light out from behind the camera. That makes it look like there's a big cliff behind the camera, and it gives more shadow from the front. So you get this like edge lighting on the entire environment and Kong, and you get no unnecessary forward lighting, which makes it look very flat. But this next part was probably the most difficult one to get right, and that was the particles. I wanted to make it look like as Kong's foot is scraping down the cliff and his hand is landing on it, that there are rocks coming off and there's dust following from those rocks. So it was very difficult to figure out how to do, but I ended up going with low poly rocks, the same ones that you put on the floor, because you can add thousands of those in and it's not gonna make your PC crash. So I made those rocks come out where his hand was making contact and his foot was scraping, and then I made dust follow those rocks out, and it ended up looking something like this. And then when you go into rendered view after all that effort, you can barely see it, because it's the exact same color as the cliff behind it, but in motion, if you're looking for it, it's there, and it's one of those subtle details that added a little bit extra to the scene, and I'm happy to do that, because without it, his foot would just be scraping, and there would be no rocks coming off. So then I had an idea, why not make my life even more difficult by adding in some trees on top of the cliff, wait for it, that shake when Kong lands on the cliff. So I got some low poly trees and I animated them to shake. Then I scattered thousands of them all across the top of the cliff so that when his hand lands, all of the trees just shake in sync. And again, you can't even really see it in the final thing, but it's just one of those subconscious, like, okay, there's a little bit of movement there, that makes sense. But I didn't want it to be noticeable or take away from the action. But the trees were so small that you couldn't even see it in the final thing. Then I added some final touches, which was the mountain in the background, and then a cliff on the right side, right behind Godzilla. So after all that hard work, I rendered each element out separately, and then composited them together, threw in some post-processing, some color grading, and then some sound design, and after all that hard work, I called it good. I'd like to thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this breakdown. If you guys are interested in seeing a full fight scene between Kong and Godzilla, let me know in the comments and I'll make that. All of this work takes quite a lot of time, so if you do decide to subscribe, then it does mean a lot. And for those of you who are interested or aspiring to become an animator, I made this 100% with inside of Blender, which is a free program that you can use. And at some point in the near future, I'm going to be releasing a step-by-step tutorial on how to make this animation on my Patreon. So if you're interested, then go check that out. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you later.